The oil in that small glass bottle was cracked open by hand, one nut at a time. A woman sat with a flat stone in her lap, placed a hard brown nut on it, and struck it with a smaller stone in her right hand. She did that several thousand times to fill the bottle you are holding. That stone, that nut, and that hand explained the price on the label, and they explain everything that has happened to this tree in the last 30 years. One honest thing about the word banned before we walk out to the tree, because the word is pointing backwards here: Morocco protects this tree with law. Rangers, permits, and a UNESCO map cover the forest, and cutting a single argan tree with an axe is a criminal act across roughly 2.5 million hectares of ground. So the story is stranger than a hidden plant in a cupboard. A government put a legal fence around one species of tree across an area the size of a small country, and the reason is written into the sand around its roots. If you are enjoying videos like this, hit the like button, because these take a great deal of work to put together, and subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next. Let me walk you out to the ground it grows in, because the landscape is the first surprise. The argan tree grows in southwestern Morocco, in the dry, stony valleys inland from the beaches of Agadir and the white walls of Essaouira, and on no other continent on earth. The soil there is pale, cracked, and scattered with rock, and the horizon behind it is the Sahara. Wheat fields fail on that ground, and olive groves struggle on it. The trees themselves look like something carved rather than grown. Thick, twisted trunks, low, spreading crowns full of thorns and gray bark, split by the sun. They look ancient in a photograph because the wood in front of your camera is ancient. A mature argan tree stands in that soil for 150 to 200 years and carries fruit through most of them. Plant a seedling in that stony ground, and the children of your grandchildren will fill baskets from the same tree. The engine for all of that sits under the sand. The argan sends roots deep into the dry ground, past the layer where rain reaches, down to moisture that stays there through a drought that browns everything else on the hillside. Those roots hold the soil in place, and that grip is the reason for the law. Now look at the branches, because you have almost certainly seen the photograph. Goats stand up in the crown of an argan tree, 4 or 5 of them, several feet above the sand, staring straight down the lens at you. Photographers sell that image on postcards across Morocco, and most people who see it assume the animals were placed there with a ladder. The goats climb those branches on their own. The tree carries a small green fruit shaped like an olive, and on that dry hillside, a tree loaded with fruit is the best meal in the landscape, so the herd goes up the trunk after it. The branches sit low, the trunks fork into wide steps, and a goat's hoof grips that bark better than most people expect. The traditional harvest ran straight through those animals. A goat chews the soft fruit off the nut, and that nut is armored hard enough to pass through the animal whole. So herders collected the nuts off the ground and out of the droppings, washed them, and carried them home in sacks. That practice fed the oil trade for generations, and it cost the household nothing, because the goats did the picking and the peeling on the branches. Modern production keeps the goats out of the food chain. Workers now pick the fruit off the branches and off clean ground, spread it on rooftops and mats to dry, and strip the pulp away by hand. One honest note about that famous photograph: along some tourist roads, handlers now lift goats into the branches and hold them there for camera money, and those staged trees are an animal welfare problem rather than a harvest. Now pick up the nut itself, because this small brown object is where the entire price of the oil lives. Under the dried pulp sits a hard woody shell, and inside that shell are 1 to 3 pale kernels the size of a sunflower seed. That shell is extraordinary. Growers in Morocco will tell you it takes roughly 16 times the force of a hazelnut shell, and you can hear the difference when a hammer lands on one. The shape of the nut is the real problem in front of you. The shell is knobbly and irregular, and the kernel inside is small and soft. So a machine that hits hard enough to split the shell crushes the kernel with it and turns a bottle of oil into paste. So the work stays in a woman's hands, on a mat, in the courtyard of a cooperative. She holds a flat stone against her knee, sets the nut on it, brings a smaller stone down at an angle she learned from her mother, and lifts the 2 kernels out with her fingertips. Then she reaches into the basket for the next nut. Engineers have built machines for that mat. Workshops in Morocco and laboratories abroad have tried, because there is real money sitting in that bottleneck, and the stone in her hand still wins on the number of intact kernels. Now put a scale under the basket, because the arithmetic is the point. 30 kilograms of fruit yields roughly 1 liter of oil. That is a full crate of fruit on the floor, beside a bottle you could hold in one hand. And every one of those nuts passed under that stone. Traditionally, a woman spent a full working day, and often longer, moving a pile of fruit through her hands to fill one bottle. So when you see the price sticker on argan oil next to a large tin of olive oil, that gap is a picture of hours of work rather than a marketing decision. Let me walk you through the whole sequence, because every step of it happens on a table or a mat rather than in a machine. Workers gather the fruit into baskets, picking it off thorny branches and off stony ground. They spread that fruit across flat rooftops and courtyards to dry in the sun, sometimes for weeks, until the green skin shrivels onto the shell. They strip the dried pulp off by hand and by beating, and they carry that pulp out to the goats and the cattle as feed, so nothing on the mat is wasted. Then comes the cracking stone. Women sort the kernels on a tray, pushing broken and darkened pieces aside, because one bad kernel colors a whole batch of oil. For the culinary oil, the kernels go into a shallow pan over a low fire and turn golden. And that pan is a skilled moment, because a pale kernel gives a weak oil and a blackened one ruins the batch. Then a stone quern turned by hand grinds the roasted kernels into a thick brown paste. The women knead that paste with a little warm water in a wide bowl, and the oil separates and rises, and it is pressed, settled, and poured off into bottles. 9 steps on a table, and only the final press has moved into a modern machine. Now the 2 bottles on the shelf, because shoppers mix them up constantly. Cosmetic argan oil is pressed from raw kernels that never went into the roasting pan. It pours pale gold, it smells mild, and it fills the small bottles sold for skin and hair. Culinary argan oil comes from kernels roasted in that pan first. It pours darker, and it carries a deep, nutty smell that fills a kitchen the moment the cap comes off. 2 bottles, 1 tree, 2 different processes. The culinary bottle stays off the stove. Cooks in Morocco drizzle it over a plate of couscous or a tajan at the table, and pour it into a shallow dish for bread to be dipped in. The best argument for that bottle sits in a bowl called amlu, argan oil, ground almonds, and honey, stirred into a thick brown paste that goes onto warm bread at breakfast, and anybody who eats it stops asking why the oil is expensive. The oil carries vitamin E and unsaturated fats, which is the basis for the claims printed on the label. Treat that label with care. Shelves are full of argan bottles wrapped in advertising, and what sits inside is a nutritious oil with an unusual flavor rather than a medicine in a dropper. Now walk back out to the forest, because the law in the title is a story about that ground rather than about the bottle. Through the 20th century, axes and saws went into the argan forest steadily. The wood is dense and burns hot, so trees were cut for cooking fires and stacked into charcoal kilns. Bulldozers cleared stands for tomato fields and orange groves, and herds of goats and camels grazed the seedlings down to bare stalks. That last picture is the quiet killer in the landscape. A hillside of old trees with no young saplings under them is a forest already ending, even while every trunk is still standing. Surveys through that century recorded the forest shrinking across large areas and thinning badly where it remained, and that hillside sits directly against the Sahara. The argan roots underneath hold the sand and the stony soil in place. The crowns shade the ground, and the whole belt stands between the dunes and the farms behind it. Pull those trunks out, and the sand walks forward. That process has a name in soil surveys and satellite photographs, and the argan belt is one of the walls in front of it. That tree is a whole farm on its own, which is part of what made the losses so sharp. The crown throws shade onto a hillside with almost no other shade for a goat, a donkey, or a farmer. The pulp and the pressed cake feed livestock in the pen. The fallen leaves feed the herd. The blossom feeds bees. And hives sit under argan trees in a landscape with very little else in flower. And the shade under the branches lets barley and almonds grow in soil that would bake bare in the open sun. So the choice in front of a farmer with an axe is his whole hillside against a single load of charcoal. Morocco answered that with paper and rangers. Written protection over the argan forest goes back to the 1920s, restricting the axe and setting out who may harvest what. And in 1998, a UNESCO designation drew a map around roughly 2.5 million hectares of that landscape, as a biosphere reserve. An axe against an Argan trunk is now a crime on that map. That is the ban in the title, and the fence is around the tree rather than around the oil. Recognition has kept building since in 2021, the United Nations marked the 10th of May on the calendar as the International Day of Argania, which is an unusual page to give a single species of tree. The hands and the stones are protected as well, listed as intangible cultural heritage, which covers the harvesting, the cracking mat, the roasting pan, and the knowledge held by the women in that courtyard. That paperwork matters more than it sounds. A fenced forest full of protected trunks that nobody walks into, in a region where the cracking stone has gone quiet, is a forest waiting for the next bulldozer. Protecting the mat keeps people out among the trees with baskets, watching the ground and depending on it. Then something arrived that no ranger planned, and it changed every household in those valleys. The bottle became famous. Through the 1990s and 2000s, argan oil moved off a village shelf and onto shop counters in Paris, New York, and Tokyo, and the price on the label climbed sharply. And the thing that turned that rising price into standing trees rather than into more axes was a building with a courtyard. The women's cooperative, every stage of this work, had always been in women's hands. The baskets, the drying roof, the cracking stone, the grinding quern, and the pouring bowl were all theirs. And the money from the bottle was not. From the 1990s, cooperatives opened across the region, with a signed membership list and a shared bank account. Work by Professor Zubida Sharof, a chemist who studied the oil in a laboratory and campaigned for the forest, sits behind a great deal of that change. Under that arrangement, the woman at the cracking stone is a member of the organization that sells the bottle. She takes a share of the sale price, and many of those courtyards run literacy classes alongside the trays of kernels. That detail is not decoration on the conservation story, and it is worth staying with. The stone and the basket had always existed. What moved was the money and the pen. Before the cooperative, a woman handed her kernels to a middleman at the door and took a payment for the labor. With no bank book in the house and no way to read the contract on the table, the cooperative put three things in her hands: a share of the price on the bottle, a name on a membership list, and in many courtyards, the ability to read the paper she was signing. The trees on the hillside feel that directly. A household whose bread money hangs in those branches guards the branches, and a household looking at a woodpile sees firewood. So the standing forest and the women's income are the same mechanism rather than to programs running side by side. That is an unusually clean picture of something conservation frequently gets wrong, which is a fence trying to do the work of a wage. Now, the honest problems, because the crowded shop shelf brought its own pressures back onto the hillside, demand for those bottles has grown very fast, and a slow tree on a fixed patch of ground cannot grow with it. That pushes harvesting harder across the same forest every season. The cooperative courtyard is also not the whole industry. Middlemen, and larger factories buy kernels too. And the share of the shop price that reaches the woman at the stone varies enormously depending on whose label is on the bottle. Adulteration sits on shelves around the world. Cheap sunflower and soy oil goes into bottles wearing an argan label because an expensive oil with a limited harvest is an obvious target for a funnel and a cheaper drum. Goats and camels are still eating seedlings on that hillside. The axe is off the trunks, and the young trees are still going down teeth first, and a forest of old crowns with bare ground beneath them has a problem that shows up decades later, and pumps have gone into that valley. Irrigated fields around the Argan belt draw the water table down, and those deep roots only help while there is water at the bottom of them. So the picture on that hillside is a genuine success, with a herd still grazing through it. Now the practical part, starting with the bottle in a shop, read the label for the word roasted before you pay, because that single word tells you whether you are holding a kitchen bottle or a bathroom bottle. Look for a cooperative name and a village on that label. A bottle that names a place and an organization is telling you something, and a bottle covered in photographs of dunes and camels is telling you nothing. Expect a high price on that shelf and look twice at a cheap bottle, because the stone and the mat behind it did not get cheaper. Open the cap and smell it. Real culinary argan fills your hand with a strong, roasted, nutty smell, and a bland oil in a fancy bottle is answering the question for you. Then keep that bottle in a cupboard, rather than on a sunny windowsill, with the cap closed, and finish it, because the oil turns stale in warm light. Now the tree in your own garden, and here the answer for most viewers is a straight one. The argan needs hot, dry ground with no frost on it. A garden that sees ice on the grass in winter kills a young argan in its first season. Where the ground suits it, the seedling still grows slowly. And years pass before a basket comes off it. Researchers have planted trial argan groves outside Morocco, including in Israel, studying it as a crop for dry country, and those plots are still young. What travels out of Morocco is the model rather than the seedling, and that is the more useful thing in this video. A deep-rooted tree on poor stony ground, producing a high-value bottle, holding the soil down, and standing for a century without a plow going near it. Look at a wheat field beside that hillside for a moment. Almost every field feeding the world holds an annual crop, planted from a sack every spring, cut every autumn, and turned over by a plow in between, with bare soil sitting under the rain. That system fills the shelves of every supermarket on Earth, and it is one of humanity's great achievements. It also puts a blade through the topsoil every year, in a world where that soil layer is washing off hillsides faster than it forms. The argan hillside is the other arrangement. No sack of seed, no plow, no bare ground, and baskets coming off trunks that were standing before anybody now alive was born. And that tree pays for the ranger patrolling it, because the bottle in a shop in Paris keeps the axe off the trunk in Morocco. Now the honest limits on all of it. The argan bottle is a small, high-value product from one corner of one country, and a hectare of that hillside will never feed people the way a hectare of wheat does. The cracking stone that makes the oil valuable also caps it. A product that needs a full day of hands per liter stays a small industry. And that ceiling is permanent rather than temporary. And there is a tension in the middle of the shop shelf that has no clean answer. The crowded shelf that made those trunks worth protecting is the same shelf now pushing the harvest harder, and how that settles over the next few decades is genuinely open. So stand back and look at the whole hillside for a moment. There is a tree at the edge of the Sahara that fills baskets for the better part of a century, in stony ground that starves a wheat field, with no irrigation pipe and no sack of seed. Goats climbed its branches to harvest it, which is a sentence that would sound invented if the photographs on the postcard rack did not exist. Its nut is armored hard enough that a woman with 2 stones still beats every machine anybody has wheeled into that courtyard, and a legal map protects it, drawn not because the tree is pretty on a hillside, but because when the trunks came out, the sand came forward. So the answer to the question in the title is a fence around the trunk rather than a lock on the bottle. The axe was banned because a government looked at that hillside and saw a wall rather than a woodpile. That is a different way to look at a tree.